You're listening to the Valley Current.
How have you been? Since we've talked, we have a new president-elect, so that's all good news.
There is a God.
You look forward to living through another 4 years of what might be an extended period of COVID. I thought we should talk about whether this vaccine is really going to work. The stock market seems to think it's going to work. And I don't know whether you can say, just based on some trials, that it's really going to work as well as they're predicting.
Well, my source of information is Tony Fauci, and he's very optimistic. And this vaccine is the first of its kind, to the best of my knowledge, because it's using one of the RNA sequences in the COVID-19 virus. But what concerns me is that the talking heads who are confusing everything by stating with three different numbers that I've heard of, the cold temperature at which the vaccine has to be held in order to prevent deterioration. I've heard 70, 75 or 80, and 94. The probability is that it must be kept at the temperature of dry ice, which is minus 72. So I don't understand where these other numbers come from, but they also argue that it's going to be very difficult to keep it at that temperature in various, underdeveloped countries. There has to be access to dry ice. Right. There are lasers that go down to that temperature, but they're pretty expensive instruments.
When you look at the distribution problem, isn't part of the problem that many people are against vaccines? And many people just don't want to be vaccinated because they worry that it's going to actually corrupt their body?
Well, of course. The antivaxxers are there by the millions, and there's nothing to do about them. We'll just let the Darwin effect take place. But,
right. But don't they represent a threat for people who have even been vaccinated, that there could be effectively some additional contagion, or do you think the vaccination will pretty much eliminate that?
Well, it has yet to be determined how long the immunity lasts when this alleged vaccine is used,
or even how fast it operates, right?
Well, that's been determined by the field trial that has just been completed. At least, I forget how many people, several thousand people, but there has not been enough time to establish how long that immunity lasts. So we know nothing about that.
But let's take three cases. Someone that's got COVID-19, the vaccine is kind of irrelevant for, right?
Well, not necessarily. Not necessarily true.
So the vaccine becomes a remedy as well as a prophylactic.
That hasn't been established yet. That test has not been conducted and probably won't be for a while, because it's more important to do what they're doing right now.
Right.
That is to determine the efficacy and safety in uninfected participants.
Right, but don't we also have a risk that there will be some mutation or something new that plays out here? Or is this sort of like, no, the odds are against it, maybe we wait another 100 years? Like, it seems to me that more and more people are recognizing that maybe there's a shortening of cycles as opposed to a lengthening of cycles. That is, what used to be like the 100-year flood is now maybe every 10 years or every 20 years. The major floods that we sometimes have, at least in California.
Well, that flies in the face of the data, because the coronavirus group consists of common cold, viruses, what used to be called the rhinoviruses, are, as you well know, we don't have a vaccine against because they mutate frequently. There are several hundred different strains of common cold viruses, which is why we contact them over and over again. The flu virus, another member of the corona group, also mutates annually at least, and that's why we have an annual flu vaccine requirement.
Right. But
and there's also good evidence that the corona-19 virus also mutates. So at best, it may be necessary to have a new vaccine against a coronavirus variant annually. There could be a mutation that occurs, as has happened now, that is so virulent that you can't develop a vaccine in time to deal with it before it spreads as much as this one has. And that may occur every 10 decades or less.
Right. So we might be in for kind of a whole new world, or at least our kids or grandkids might be in for a whole new world.
It's not new in respect to plagues. They go back to recorded history. They're not all caused by viruses, but as far as major pandemics are concerned, we've had them throughout human civilization since recorded history, and undoubtedly before history was recorded. So this is nothing new in the broad sense of it. And fortunately, we know enough about virology to know how to deal with it, although it's sometimes impeded, as it was and has been in this country, by political idiots.
Well, you know where my head goes when you say something like that? It goes in the direction of saying, instead of all the military power that's been a huge part of the world budget, the world GDP has spent a tremendous amount on military expansion. What if all that money had gone into some view that the common enemy for the entire world is a plague or a series of plagues or pandemics, and all that money that goes into military might would shift into either research or development or whatever medical treatments that you might have? I imagine we would have a much higher degree of knowledge than we have now.
I would take issue with that belief because the amount of money spent worldwide on armaments and instruments of war is so vast that that's a sum far in excess of what's needed to deal with virus pandemics, as the present one indicates.
Right, but we might have been way ahead in thinking through solutions.
No, I don't think that's true. I think that we would have been way ahead if the politicians didn't behave as they have.
Right, but
that has been the greatest impediment to the development of this vaccine.
Wouldn't we have that knowledge effectively? Like if you actually take some of those vast resources and you bring about the learning, like if you say there was something learned globally from this, or we're in the process of learning globally from this as a global society, more or less, people are recognizing that it's probably a much bigger threat right now than nuclear war is. The pandemic is a bigger threat to the destruction of humanity.
Well, I'm not sure I understand your argument, but we have the fundamental knowledge today to to execute the production of vaccines. It was not necessary to determine some new biological principles or fundamental biological discoveries like the discovery of DNA or RNA. All of that knowledge exists. It's the execution of the knowledge to produce the vaccine that is happening now without the necessity to know what a virus is, for example. It's like the execution of all of the physical principles and engineering principles to fly to the moon and back. When the physical principles were understood and the engineering principles were understood, after a couple of terrible accidents, of course, things seem to be going rather smoothly in respect to space science. So the principles are known, and they're known better now than when I was making vaccines. The new principles have been developed, and one of the new principles is the basis for the current COVID-19 vaccine from Pfizer. Incidentally, Pfizer was the first one in this country to produce the polio vaccine in my WI38 cells. I think I sent you a link so you can see pictures of it.
Right, though the pictures are still there. So it's a real feather in Pfizer's hat that they're going to get credit for this. And they obviously, I'm sure the stock has just skyrocketed. I know that the Zoom video stock with the video recording software that we're using, which, that stock has done extremely well. It's taken quite a hit just based on the view that people are going to go back to work in offices, which is a little hard for me to believe that's going to happen this year. At least from everything I'm seeing, people are still a little worried about getting into elevators with other people and that sort of thing. But, at some point, I suppose people will be asked by their employers to go back to work, and the government will say, yes, it's okay to go back to work. But the data, I sent you that latest New York Times clip, the data seems pretty terrible in terms of where we are in the cycle of things, right?
And that's the Dow. The NASDAQ is not doing very well. They lost several hundred points in the past few days. So technological stocks are not doing as well as the Dow is. So I don't know how much faith you can put on those numbers.
Right. It's a little bit. It's a little bit like the world is zigzagging around when will people actually get back to some sense of normalcy, and it may be never. Right.
It may have been discovered that a substantial part of the labor force can, in fact, function very well at home,
right,
or away from a physical entity that requires them to be together in one building. And that discovery may have many benefits, although it has a downside too.
Right. Or you could say this is also the beginning of robotics starting to take over the way in which we end up doing business altogether, right?
Well, robotics, of course, have made a significant impact in manufacturing facilities, taken away labor jobs that 40 or 50 years ago were absolutely necessary because we didn't have robotics.
Right.
So, but the labor force seems to have dealt pretty well with that because we have not have extraordinary unemployment that can be stipulated to be caused by robotics. On the contrary, I think the markets have moved forward, maybe not in spite of the robot, because of them.
I get the sense that some corporations have looked at this as an opportunity to more or less justify terminations and justify, sort of a move towards more streamlining. So at least the bottom 20% of what might be called the dead wood, or the people that are no longer essential. If you're not essential, it may be that corporations now have a free pass to more or less axe a lot of people based on the view that, hey, things are challenging in operating in this style of business.
If they discover that they can do businesses as well with many of their relatively senior people working from home compared to having them return to the buildings that were previously occupied by those people, then yes, there will be a lot of savings of money. For example, they don't have to pay for janitorial services or energy for running big buildings that might be easily reduced to 25% of their former size. And the energy costs will be borne by the people who are working from their home. And they will also be doing their own janitorial work at home. Right. So from that standpoint, that could be a rather large change in costs borne by major companies and by individuals.
So you mentioned earlier as we were talking that you thought Fauci was kind of optimistic, but he also did caution, I guess, earlier today or earlier this year, that the flu season would likely make this winter pretty tough, right?
Well, there are two different things, but you're right. He's not optimistic, and he shouldn't be, about the future spread of this disease, because people are simply not obeying the simple rules that we all know they should be obeying. And furthermore, I've taken notice of many mask wearers who are not wearing the mask properly. And that seems to have escaped the attention of people who are trying to get people to wear masks without adding to that sentence properly. That means covering your nose and your mouth. The mouth seems to be covered in most cases. But I've seen many people with the edge of the mask below the nostrils.
Right.
What is that?
Well, don't you think that one of the things Biden should promise is that there's going to be like an issuance of masks right from the government, like the equivalent of, we will actually issue you and your family a mask?
Well, there may be a time when it's determined that some of the cloth masks that people are sewing up at home or in some small company that they've invented, that they are not as good as a surgical mask, which is probably true, but at the moment they're effective enough. So it is possible that in the future surgical masks may be required, but at the moment I don't see any necessity for that. I happen to use surgical masks, but I also happen to be living in circumstances where I'm never in contact with the public. So in addition to that, I also wear a face guard when I go out, but I rarely encounter people. I'm obligated to do that about once a month when I go grocery shopping, but I wear all of that protection that I just described, and I do many other things to protect myself, like washing my hands and face with 70% plus alcohol, and wiping down the steering wheel of my car, and other things that I do because of my knowledge of virology.
Right, but you could theoretically improve even further and have something like Instacart pick up your groceries and deliver them to your garage and just accept whatever they choose.
There is no service of that sort in my rural area. So
there isn't?
No.
Oh, and not even an ability to hire someone locally to do that, because that would be the other approach.
I could hire someone to do it, but that risk my exposure to that person, that would be much reduced. So yes, I could hire somebody to do it, but I don't have to. I have a daughter who lives an hour and a half away, and in fact, she just brought me $200 worth of groceries from Costco on last Saturday. Placed them outside my garage door, my closed garage door. And when she left, I'd opened the door and stored the groceries where they should be stored.
Yeah, and then you put the UV light on it, right?
Sometimes, but my understanding, the studies that have been done about the likelihood that this virus will remain viable on years like that is pretty minimal. Furthermore, I'm washed in alcohol before and after I deal with those packages. So if there is virus on those packages, I pretty much dispensed with them or at least inactivated them with alcohol.
But you also have your own vegetables going on in your own backyard, so you can actually pick stuff right out of your backyard, right?
Yes. At the moment, I have nothing growing. It's too chilly, but I will in a couple of months.
So do you see yourself maintaining this approach for a while? Like, if you had to guess when social interactions will increase in your life, what would you say? A year from now?
Several months ago, I decided that this issue is going to be overturned till late next year.
So a year from now, like 12 months from now.
Exactly.
Right?
I don't think this is going to change much.
Right. How many Americans can actually deal with this? Because Americans have a hard time being sort of locked up, if that's the right word for it, restrained,
yes.
Right?
Yes, it is very difficult for millions of people, absolutely. And much of that has been caused again by the Republican leaders in this country who have failed to understand the need to provide funds to people who are living on the margin. It's just that simple to my mind. And to go further, the frequent discussions about the discordance in this country, I think that all has its origins with arch conservative Republicans. That's what has and still is providing the fodder that keeps people in this country apart. It's sad, but that's my personal analysis. I'm sure others would disagree, but that's how it appears to me pretty clearly.
Well, I summarize it by saying the sort of right-wing Republicans live in the past and look backwards as, hey, the good old days were like this. And the really left-wing Democrats live in the future, where kind of there is no work required anymore because everything's taken care of and everyone can get a stipend from the government and more or less take care of themselves. Like, it's a very futuristic view. It's the view that one of the candidates, Yang, had, that, hey, the future is a leisure class future where there is no concept of work. And there's, sort of this discourse or dissonance between a view about the past and let's go back to the past, and a view about the future that's not quite arrived yet, and certainly has not arrived in third world countries, unless you say, well, it sort of arrives by way of the way in which they rely on charity as opposed to actual means of production. Although many of those countries are rich in many resources that are not yet fully utilized. But yeah, it's a sort of a different vision for what's the best world to be living in. And it's almost like the United States has people that believe there are two different worlds. It's that extreme. It seems that extreme.
Yes, I mean, the inequitable distribution of wealth, the root of most of these problems. The cause of that is very complicated, but Biden, for example, says that if, and others, argues that if we increase taxes on people who make multiple, I think he said $400,000 or more in income annually, if we increase taxes by 1% on those people, which will not hurt them at all financially, then that increase in income by the government could do an enormous amount of increase in the health and care and wealth even of people below that income level. There's a lot of truth to that belief, especially now with the discrepancy as wide as it is. What person making over $400,000 a year will be unhappy and saddened terribly to pay an additional $1,000 a year in taxes? I don't understand why that's not acceptable.
Well, there's almost a strange game that plays out to try to get on the Forbes 500 list of the wealthiest people in the world. Clearly, Donald Trump views that as important. And if you view that as important, like if you really view as important that you be considered one of the 500 most wealthy individuals, then every last nickel that you save on taxes becomes viewed as critical to hitting that net worth number. There was actually a podcast or an interview of someone who wrote a book about how Donald Trump sort of manipulated his taxes to be able to get those high numbers that allowed him to actually claim that he was, and apparently according to this author, he is a billionaire. And he's gotten there through some very smart maneuvers tax-wise. And I have to say, clearly every one of those billionaires has various tax accountants, and they're not exactly cutting checks to the government. They may be cutting checks to charity, but they're not cutting checks to the government saying, hey, I've made enough money. I'm Bezos and I've made so much money. I'm on the way to becoming a trillionaire. Why don't I give $100 billion to the government to try to help it straighten out this problem, the COVID problem, or even better, the election problem, how much we spend trying to tabulate paper ballots and have people argue about them when we have these electronic devices in our hands that can be verified and can be made to act as voting booths. I mean, they're doing just about everything else. It's crazy to me what time and money is spent to process paper ballots when there are secure ways of getting a ballot to be returned on a phone or on some electronic device with some verification. I mean, it's amazing to me that we haven't spent a lot more money and a lot more of our budget just figuring out more convenient ways of holding elections. Right now, it seems like we do it in the worst way possible.
Well, to get back to your first statements about Trump's goal of becoming a billionaire just to get on some list is another example of his stupidity and the stupidity of other people whose values are to be on a Fortune 100, Fortune 500, or some other list like that. I mean, that's about as stupid a goal as one can have. It has no ethical or moral value. It's simply the ultimate in materialism. And I simply have no time for that, and I don't know why anybody should have. As far as the elections are concerned, that's an industry. There are millions of men and women who are employed in the industry of elections. It's not only people employed, but it's in industries that print ballots, that print machines to be used by voters. They're complex machines in some cases. The whole huge system, which varies also because the responsibility of conducting elections is done by states and not by the federal government. And within states, you have individual counties who employ people full-time to organize elections, to send out bids for printers and for manufacturing voting machines. So undoing that huge industry is not going to happen overnight, despite the facts that it is probably simpler, easier, and free of fraud to do the whole darn thing electronically, nationally.
Right, but at some point,
to vote from your home.
Right. I mean, at some point, though, people do wake up to the fact that the inertia is costing everyone way too much anxiety, because there were many people that were really on the edge of their seat about whether this election was going one way or another. And as I said, I think to you, or I thought I may have said to you, there were lots of people that called me once Biden was affirmed by Pennsylvania, and they said, they were so relieved that, that there was some finality to this. And of course, there still is not finality, because there's a case pending actually in the Supreme Court that probably will actually get heard. I don't think it's going to go Donald's way, but fundamentally, it sort of suggests we're spending millions, if not billions, of mental cycles. Let's forget about the money. The entire nation is riveted to CNN and Fox News, depending on your preference, to look at things like who's winning, when electronically we could have an exact tabulation, probably with far less risk of fraud than all this paper shuffle that we do.
Yeah. Well, of course that's true, but it's not going to happen. There's too much invested in that huge election industry.
Right. It's like talking about big pharma, I suppose. There's so much vested in that.
Yeah, well, that's a different story entirely. But as far as the election is concerned, there are algorithms that can be written, probably have already been written, in which this election system could be conducted with people voting at home with absolute protection.
Well, we do that.
Most people are doing their banking at home.
Right. We're doing corporate voting. If you vote as a shareholder, it's all happening electronically these days.
Well, yeah.
This idea of going to a meeting is just not really playing out. Let me ask you a question. What would you tell Joe Biden he should do if you had to give him advice about what he should do in his first 100 days? What would you tell him?
I think what he should do is the opposite of everything that Trump did, and that would be excellent for this country.
That's an easy playbook for him. He just goes through the list and he starts reversing all those decisions.
Exactly. That's exactly what he should do.
Okay, Len, thanks for your time. I'll look forward to getting together with you next week. Sorry we've had a little bit of a hiccup here, but you take care. Bye-bye.
Tune in next time on The Valley Current.